Hello, I'm Helen, and I want to tell you about the time I got revenge on my high school bully after graduation. My bullying situation was similar to most. I would be picked on daily, and no matter what I did to avoid them, they would always find a way to make my life miserable. Whether that would be from calling me bad names, embarrassing me in front of all of my peers, forcing me to run their errands for them, or pretty much anything else they could conjure up, you name it, they made me do it. The worst part was that I couldn't even go to my teachers for help because my bully was actually my teacher. Miss Smith was very popular with both the staff and the students, so whenever I tried to complain, I was the one who looked like the bad guy. She was polite to everyone else, smiling all the time, helpful to the students, and assisted other teachers with their classes. Miss Smith, or Sydney, to everyone but me, had the whole school wrapped around her little finger. "How could you say such a thing about Sydney?" was the usual response I would get from other students, and the principal wasn't any better. Whenever I went to him for help, he would tell me, "We've never received a complaint before. Maybe you're just misunderstanding her." I wasn't misunderstanding anything, and he would just make matters worse after my complaints. Whenever he would go talk to her, he would always walk away charmed, and I would be punished later. Officially, I was her assistant, a title she gave to me after my last complaint didn't work. Unofficially, though, I was her servant. She would make me pick up the class worksheets, and I would be the one filling them out. If I made a mistake, she would yell at me, cursing and throwing the papers onto the ground. Then I would have to pick them up and start all over again. At one point in time, I tried ignoring her, but she started failing me on purpose, putting Fs on all of my tests. I also tried to comply with what she wanted, but she would yell and scream that it was never good enough. It got so bad that every time I heard my name, I would flinch in fear of what she would want me to do next. And when she saw that, her face would delight in my fear. She was so admired by everyone that I started to believe that the whole school was out to get me. I was constantly tormented. It felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. So when graduation came around, I was overjoyed. It was finally an end to all of the suffering that I had put up with throughout high school. And now I could move on. However, I could feel something bubbling up inside of me as I sat and waited for my name to be called on graduation day. When the principal called my name, I cowered in my seat, looking around to see where she was. Graduation was supposed to be an incredible time for me, but Miss Smith still had her claws inside my brain. Her control was forever hanging heavy over my head. I wasn't going to take it anymore. I knew that as long as I continued to let her have power over me, I would never be able to live my life happily. So, knowing that she wouldn't be able to do anything to me anymore, I decided to get my revenge. After graduation, I went to the nearest store and bought many Bluetooth-activated palm-sized alarms. On many different occasions, she'd had me run personal errands for her, so I knew where she lived. And I also knew that she had a spare key hidden behind her back door. I waited for her and her husband to leave the house and snuck inside. I hid the alarms all over her home. Upstairs, downstairs, in the bedroom, in the kitchen. I didn't miss a spot. That night, all I had to do was sit back and wait for them to go to sleep. I parked not far from their house to watch it all unfold and waited for the last light in the house to go out. I pulled up the app on my cell phone and turned on the first alarm. I waited and laughed for 5 minutes until the signal turned off on their end. Only 5 minutes had passed from start to finish, but it was the best 5 minutes of my life. That night I slept soundly for the first time in what felt like years. It was like I was getting my life back for once. She was no longer in control. Night after night, I watched as their sleep was interrupted, the lights going off, then coming back on, the sensor on my app telling me that it was finally disabled after minutes of them searching. All of this made each night worthwhile and resulted in a fair amount of hysterical laughter from me. It was so satisfying to be able to get revenge on Miss Smith after everything she'd put me through. One morning, I was so curious about how they were handling the situation that I decided to go and check out my handiwork. I set off one of the alarms early, the one I'd placed in the kitchen, and snuck around the back to peek through the window to get a better view of their faces when they turned it off. A minute passed before Miss Smith stormed into the kitchen and yanked open the cabinets. She searched a little before she pulled out the alarm and smashed her hand on top of the button, turning it off. It was hard for me to contain my laughter, but seeing the irritation on her face and how many times she slammed her hand on the button over and over again, even after the alarm turned off, well, I couldn't help but smile. Not only was my plan working, but it was working better than I could have ever hoped for. I wanted to stand up in full view of the window and show my face to Miss Smith to let her know that it had been me all along. I wanted nothing more than to bask in her shock as she saw my face standing before her with the alarm still in her hand. But instead, I turned away from the window and pulled out my phone. Everything was going so smoothly, so I decided to turn on another alarm. If she was irritated now, I could just imagine how annoyed she'd be by hearing another alarm go off. The thought of seeing her flinch like I did all those times when she called my name filled me with joy. However, when I was about to press the button, I heard mumbling coming from inside. When I looked back through the window, I saw Miss Smith crying. At first, I didn't care. I mean, after all of the things she'd done to me, it was only right that she experienced a little bit of the pain that I'd undergone for so long. But then her husband came downstairs. He started yelling and screaming at her, telling her that this was all her fault. He blamed her for everything and even went as far as to accuse her of setting the alarms herself. She denied it, and they started to argue, but he wouldn't back down. I could hear him screaming things at her that she used to say to me. "How could you be so stupid? You know I have to work early in the morning, and now you're playing these ridiculous games? You're worthless. There'll be trouble if you don't find every single alarm before I get back today." He physically pushed past her as he stormed out of the house. Then he got into his car and drove away. I was shocked. I actually felt sorry for her and was about to leave. But that's when I heard another voice shouting. This time, it was a woman. I looked inside the window, and an old woman was standing there screaming at Miss Smith. Her voice was so loud and annoying.
"You will never be the wife my son deserves!"
she screamed.
"Both of us are miserable because of you! Get the hint already, and leave us to live in peace!"
I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The old woman looked absolutely terrifying. Miss Smith paused for a moment and then shouted, "Helen!" I froze. My whole body went completely numb. She'd seen me. But that's when she continued talking. "Just because you're my mother-in-law doesn't mean you can speak to me like that in my own house." Oh, whoa. Her mother-in-law had exactly the same name as me. At that moment, things started to make sense. After everything that Miss Smith had put me through, it was hard for me to feel sympathy for her. But now I was able to see everything with my own eyes. She was doing to me the things that had been done to her. I guess it was her way of getting some kind of release. I had always wondered why it was me that she decided to pick on, but it was obvious now. I felt sorry for what she was going through, but I was also angry that she had taken her frustrations out on me for so many years. After thinking about it, I realized I didn't want to be like her. She was miserable and had decided to make someone else's life miserable too, just so she could feel a bit better. That just wasn't in my nature, and I didn't want to end up like her. Two wrongs don't make a right. So I wrote a letter giving the location of the rest of the alarms and slipped it under her door. After I was done, I drove away from her house and never looked back. Have you ever been picked on by your teacher? Share what happened to you in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.